"What will you do, divorce me?" Those were the exact words my husband said while standing naked in our bedroom next to the woman I'd hired to help him get in shape. He wasn't apologizing. He was laughing. I'm a dermatologist. I run a high-end clinic in Miami Beach where celebrities and socialites trust me with their skin, their insecurities, their secrets. I'm known for being calm under pressure, for having steady hands. But in that moment, standing in the doorway of my own bedroom, watching my husband smirk at me like I was the punchline to a joke only he understood, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The woman, Vanessa, the personal trainer I'd paid to work with him, didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. She just pulled the sheet up and smiled, not a guilty smile, a knowing one. Like she'd been waiting for this moment. Derek stepped toward me, still completely at ease, and said something I'll never forget. He told me I needed him, that without him, I was just another stressed-out doctor who didn't know how to have fun, that I wouldn't leave because I didn't have the guts. He was so sure of himself, so certain I'd stay. And honestly, for about 10 seconds, I wondered if he was right. But then I looked at him, really looked, and realized something that changed. This man didn't respect. He never had. I wasn't his wife. I was his safety net, his ATM, his convenient cover for whatever life he'd been living behind my back. That's when I stopped shaking. That's when the sadness sharper, colder focus. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just turned around, walked out of that room, and started. Because if Derek thought I was going to roll over and accept this, he was about to learn he didn't know me at all. This is the story of what happened next. It's messy, it's painful, and it's absolutely true. If you want to hear how a woman who needed her husband ended up taking everything he thought he owned, stay with. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what I'm about to tell you gets so much worse before it gets better. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Derek's face, that smug, relaxed expression, like he'd been caught eating the last slice of not destroying our marriage. I left the apartment and checked into the Fontainebleau. I told myself it was just for one night, just to clear my head. But even in that beautiful hotel room with the ocean, I couldn't stop replaying everything. Not just what I'd seen, but what he'd said. Did I? I started making a mental list. I paid the mortgage, I paid for the cars, I paid for our trips to Aspen, to the Hamptons, to that villa in Tuscany last summer. Derek had his consulting business, but I'd never seen much evidence of actual work. Lots of lunches, lots of golf, lots of networking events that somehow never translated into income. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't actually know what Derek did all day. That's when the first crack, not in our marriage that was already shattered, but in the story I'd been telling myself about my life. The next morning, I went back to the apartment when I knew Derek would be at the gym. He'd texted me twice. The first message said we needed to talk. The second said I was overreacting. Nothing about being sorry, nothing about it being a mistake, just annoyance that I'd disrupted his routine. I wasn't there to talk. I was there to look. I started in his home office, the room he always kept locked when he was working on sensitive client materials. I'd never questioned. Why would I? I trusted him. God, I was so stupid. The door wasn't locked now. He'd left in a hurry that morning, probably assuming I'd stay away longer. His desk was a mess. Papers everywhere, empty coffee cups, a bottle of expensive whiskey I didn't remember buying. I started going through the drawers, not even sure what I was looking for. Bank statements, maybe. Receipts? Something to explain where his money went, since it certainly wasn't going into our joint account. What I found was worse. In the bottom drawer under a stack of golf magazines, there was a folder. Inside were credit card statements, cards I'd never seen before, in Derek's name but sent to a P.O. box address. The charges made my stomach drop. Hotels, jewelry stores, restaurants I'd never been to, charges going back years. But it was one specific receipt that made everything click into place. A payment to a luxury apartment complex in Brickell. Monthly payments for the last 18 months. Derek didn't just cheat on me in our bed that one time. He had a whole separate life. My hands started shaking again, but this time it wasn't from shock. It was from rage. I took photos of everything with my phone, every statement, every receipt, every scrap of paper that proved Derek had been lying to me for God knows how long. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I needed him to think I was still the naive wife who didn't ask questions, because I was starting to realize something. If Derek had been this careful about how else was he? I left the office and walked through our apartment like I was seeing. Looked. The expensive sound system he said was a gift. The new watch he claimed he'd bought on sale. The designer handbag he'd given me for Christmas, he bought that with my own money. Then I went to our bedroom. I couldn't help it. I stood in the doorway where I'd stood yesterday, seeing the room where my husband had looked me in the eye and dared me to leave him. That's when I noticed something on his nightstand. His iPad unlocked. He must have forgotten it in his rush this morning. I picked it up. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear. I knew I should stop, should call a lawyer, should do this the right way, but I couldn't. I opened his messages. The first thread was with Vanessa. Flirty. Disgusting, but not surprising. I scrolled back. Weeks? Months. They'd been seeing each other since last summer, since before our anniversary trip to Italy. The trip where Derek had been so attentive, so romantic. The trip where he'd told me he wanted to renew our vows. I felt sick. But then I saw another thread. A name I didn't recognize. Cassidy. I opened it. The messages were recent, from this week. Cassidy was asking when he'd be able to get away. Derek was telling her soon that he just had to handle some things at home first. She sent back a photo, a beautiful woman with red hair and a bartender's uniform, standing in what looked like a club in South Beach. There was another woman, maybe more. I sat down on the edge of the bed where Derek had betrayed me and then laughed about it. And I made a decision. I wasn't going to just divorce him. I was going to find out exactly who my husband really was. Every lie, every secret, every dollar he'd stolen from our life together. And then I was going to make sure he regretted ever underestimating. I pulled out my phone and called my business partner, Rachel. She answered on the second ring. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I asked her if her brother, the divorce attorney, was as good as everyone said he was. She asked me what was wrong. I told her I'd explain later, but right now I needed the best lawyer in Miami. She gave me his number. Then she said something that made me feel less alone. She told me that whatever I was going through, I wasn't going to face it by myself. I hung up and stared at the number on my screen. This was it. The moment I stopped being the woman Derek thought I was and became someone he never saw coming. I dialed. The lawyer's name was Mitchell Reeves, and when I told him I needed to see him today, he heard something in my voice that made him clear his schedule. But before I left the apartment, I did one more thing. I went into our home office and opened our joint bank account on the computer. I wanted to see exactly how much money we had. I needed to know what I was working with. That's when I saw it. Transfers. Regular transfers out of our joint account into an account I didn't recognize. Small amounts, $500 here, $1,000 there, always with vague descriptions. Home repairs, car maintenance, business expenses. I added them up in my head, going back just 1 year. Over $60,000. Gone. My vision blurred. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. Derek hadn't just been cheating on me. He'd been robbing me. And suddenly I realized the apartment in Brickell, the jewelry, the expensive dinners. I'd been paying for all of it. I'd been funding my husband's double life, and I hadn't even known it. I closed the laptop. Like if I moved too fast, everything would shatter. Then I walked out of that apartment. I didn't look back. Because the woman Derek married, the one who trusted him, who believed in him, who needed him, she died in that doorway yesterday. The woman walking out now, she was someone completely different. Mitchell Reeves had an office in a glass tower downtown with a view that made my clinic look modest. When I walked in, he didn't offer the usual lawyer speech about how everything would be fine. He looked at me with sharp gray eyes and said one thing: "Tell me everything, and don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad." So I did. I told him about Derek and Vanessa, about the iPad, about Cassidy, about the credit cards and the apartment in Brickell and the transfers from our joint account. Mitchell didn't take notes. He just listened. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked me a question that changed everything. He asked if I'd checked how far back those transfers went. I told him I'd only looked at the past year. He pulled out his phone and made a call right there, didn't even excuse himself. When someone answered, he said he needed a forensic accountant, needed them today. That's when I realized this was bigger than I thought. Mitchell told me not to confront Derek, not to let him know I'd found anything. He said men like my husband, men who felt entitled to everything, they had a tendency to hide more than just affairs. And if Derek thought I was coming after him, he'd start moving assets, destroying evidence, making things disappear. I needed to act like nothing had, like I was still the wife who didn't ask questions. I left Mitchell's office with a list of instructions and a pit in my stomach. I was supposed to go home, smile, pretend. The thought made me want to throw up, but I did it anyway. When Derek came home that night, I was in the kitchen making dinner like always. He looked surprised to see me. Maybe he thought I'd still be hiding in a hotel. He asked if we could talk, and I said sure, but my voice came out flat. He sat down at the kitchen island and launched into this speech about how what I saw wasn't what it looked like, how he and Vanessa had just made a mistake, how it didn't mean anything. He said he loved me. He said he wanted to make it work. I kept chopping vegetables and let him talk. Every word felt like an insult, but I nodded in the right places. When he was done, I told him I needed time to think. He seemed relieved, like I'd just given him permission to keep lying. That weekend, I met with the forensic accountant Mitchell had recommended. Her name was Diana Park, and she had a reputation for finding money that people thought they'd hidden well enough. I gave her access to everything: bank statements, tax returns, credit card records, anything I could find. 3 days later, she called me. Her voice was careful, like she was breaking bad news to a patient. She told me to come to her office. When I got there, Diana had printouts spread across her entire conference table. She walked me through it slowly, but even with her explanation, the numbers made me dizzy. The transfers from our joint account, they'd been happening for almost 5 years. Not just the small amounts I'd noticed. Derek had been pulling money consistently, systematically, always just under the amount that would trigger a bank alert. In total, it was close to $280,000. I had to sit down. Diana brought me water. She said there was more. Derek had opened a separate account I knew nothing about. He'd been depositing money there, my money, and using it to pay for the Brickell apartment. The apartment wasn't a rental. He'd bought it, and according to public records, it was in Vanessa's name. My husband had used my money to buy his mistress a home. Diana kept talking. She said Derek had also taken out credit cards using our joint income to qualify, cards that only he had access to. The debt on those cards was over $90,000. Luxury purchases, travel, cash advances. I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small. But then Diana said something that cut through the fog. She told me that Derek had been sloppy, arrogant. He'd left a trail because he never thought I'd look for one. She said we had everything we needed to bury him. I went home that night, and Derek was on the couch watching a game. He asked if I wanted to order takeout, like we were just a normal couple having a normal evening. I said sure. I sat down next to him. I even laughed at something on TV. But inside, I wasn't Sienna the trusting wife anymore. I was Sienna the woman with a plan. And Derek had no idea what was coming. The hardest part wasn't pretending I didn't know. The hardest part was sitting across from Derek at dinner, watching him lie to my face and forcing myself to smile. Mitchell had been clear. I needed more. The financial evidence was damning, but if I wanted to make sure Derek lost everything, I needed him to slip up. I needed him to reveal his endgame, whatever that was. So I played the role of the confused, hurt wife who was willing to forgive. It made me sick, but I did. That Friday, Derek suggested we go out to dinner. Somewhere nice, he said, to talk things through. He chose this expensive restaurant in Wynwood, the kind of place with mood lighting and a wine list thicker than a phone book. The kind of place I used to think was romantic. Now I just saw it for what it was. A stage. And Derek was performing. He ordered a bottle of wine I knew we couldn't afford. Or rather, that I couldn't afford. Since apparently I'd been paying for everything. He reached across. He told me he'd been doing a lot of that he realized how much he'd take. I let him I asked gentle questions. The kind of wife who wanted to save. I asked him why Vanessa. Whether it was something I'd done wrong. And that's when he made his first mistake. He told me it wasn't about me at all. He said sometimes men needed. He said the pressures of being married to someone so successful, someone who had everything figured out, sometimes it made him feel small. He was making himself the victim. In his version of the story, I was so busy with my clinic, so focused on that I'd pushed him into another woman's arms. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from but I nodded, understood, even apologized for not being more present. Derek squeezed my hand and smiled. He looked like he'd just sold me on the biggest lie of his life. Then he said something that made my blood run. He told me he'd been talking to a financial advisor about making some investments that could set us up better. He said he wanted to start fresh, build something together. He wanted access to more of my money. That's what this dinner was really about. I took a sip of wine to hide my reaction. I asked him what kind of investments he was thinking about. Derek leaned in, excited now. He started talking about a real estate opportunity, something one of his friends was involved in. He said it was a sure thing, that we could double our money in a year. He just needed me to liquidate some of my retirement accounts to get the capital together. My retirement, the accounts I'd been building since medical school, the safety net I'd worked 15-hour days to create. He wanted me to hand it over so he could invest it, and I knew exactly where that money would actually go, into whatever hole he'd been digging for the past 5 years. I told him I'd think about it, that it sounded interesting, but I'd need to see the details. Derek kissed my hand and told me he loved me. He said he knew I'd come around, that I'd see this was the right move for our future. Like we had one. I excused myself to go to the bathroom. Once I was alone in the stall, I pulled out my phone and texted Mitchell everything Derek had just said. He responded immediately, "Don't agree to anything, keep playing along, this is good." When I came back to the table, Derek had ordered dessert for us to share. He was talking about maybe taking a trip together, somewhere tropical. A second honeymoon, he called it. He was already spending the money he thought I was going to give him. We finished dinner and drove home. Derek was in a good mood, humming along to the radio. He probably thought he'd won, that I was back under control. When we got to the apartment, he kissed me at the door. Not a real kiss. It felt mechanical, obligatory. He said he had to make a quick call for work and went into his office. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the muffled sound of his voice through the door. He was talking to someone, his tone casual and confident. I crept closer. I couldn't help myself. Through the crack in the door, I heard him laugh. Then I heard him say a name. Vanessa. He told her the dinner had gone perfectly, that I was going to give him the money. He said once he had it, they could move forward with their plans. He told her to start looking at properties in the Keys, somewhere we could set up properly. The Keys. He wasn't just stealing from me. He was planning a whole new life with her, funded entirely by my work, my sacrifice, my years of building something from nothing. I backed away from the door before I did something stupid like burst in there. My hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time. I went into our bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone. I opened the voice recording app and hit record. Then I walked back to Derek's office door and stood there, letting my phone capture every word. He was still talking. He told Vanessa he'd have the money within a month. He said I was easier to manipulate than he'd thought, that I just needed to feel like I was part of the decision. He called me naive. He called me predictable. He said he'd been planning this for over a year. I stopped the recording. I had what I needed. I went back to the bedroom, forwarded the audio to Mitchell, and sat in the dark waiting for Derek to finish his call. When he finally came to bed, he wrapped his arm around me and kissed my shoulder. He whispered that he was glad we were working things out. I didn't move. I didn't speak because Derek thought he was playing me, but the truth was, I'd just let him hand me the weapon that would destroy him, and he had no idea. Mitchell called me the next morning while Derek was at the gym. He'd listened to the recording 3 times. He said it was perfect, clear evidence of fraud and intent, but then he said something that surprised me. He told me the recording revealed more than just Derek's plan to steal my retirement money. It revealed something deeper, something we needed to understand if we were going to win this completely. Mitchell asked me to come to his office. He said he wanted me to meet someone. When I arrived an hour later, there was a woman waiting in the conference. She introduced herself as Tom Chen. And yeah, she laughed at my She explained her parents had wanted a boy and named her accordingly, but she'd learned to use people's assumptions to her advantage in her line of work. Tom was a private investigator, one of the best in Florida, according to me. She shook my hand and got straight to business. She told me she'd already started looking into Derek's background. Bank records, social media, phone logs, known associates. She said Mitchell had given her the basics, but now she needed to ask me some personal questions. I told her to ask whatever she needed. Tom wanted to know when things had changed with Derek. When had he started pulling away, acting different, spending more money? I thought back, trying to pinpoint a moment. It was hard because the change had been so gradual. Then I remembered, about 5 years ago, right around the time the transfers started, Derek had gone through this phase where he suddenly cared about status. He started buying designer clothes. He wanted a better car. He complained that our apartment wasn't impressive enough, that we should be living in a penthouse. I thought it was a midlife crisis thing. Maybe insecurity about turning. I'd tried to be supportive. Tom wrote everything down. Then she asked about Derek's childhood, his family, his past relationships. I realized how little I actually knew. Derek had always been vague about his life before Miami. He said his family was complicated, that he'd rather focus on our future than dwell on the past. I thought it was romantic. Now it felt like a red flag I'd completely missed. Tom said she'd dig into Derek's history. She told me that men who ran cons like this, and make no mistake, this was a con, they usually had practice. This probably wasn't his first time. The thought made me nauseous. Had Derek married me just for my money? I spent the next week trying to act normal while Tom worked. Derek kept bringing up the investment opportunity, getting more pushy about it. He said his friend needed an answer soon. The pressure was building, and I could see him getting frustrated with my hesitation. But I held firm. I told him I needed to review the paperwork, talk to my own financial advisor. Derek's jaw would tighten every time I put him off, but he'd force a smile and say he understood. 8 days after our dinner, Tom called. She said she needed to show me something in person. I met her at a coffee shop in Coral Gables, far from anywhere Derek might be. Tom had a folder with her. She set it on the table between us and took a breath before opening it. Inside were documents, marriage certificates, divorce decrees, court records. Derek's name was on all of them. Tom explained it carefully. Before me, Derek had been married twice, both times to women who were financially independent. Both times, the marriages ended badly. The first wife, a real estate agent in Atlanta, had accused Derek of financial abuse in her divorce filing. She claimed he'd manipulated her into funding his business ventures that never materialized. The second wife, a dentist in Charlotte, had filed a restraining order. According to the court documents, Derek had become aggressive when she'd refused to give him access to her practice accounts. Both women had ended up significantly worse off financially after their divorces. Both had paid him settlements just to get him out of their lives quickly. I stared at the papers. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set down my coffee. Derek had done this before. This was his pattern. He found successful women, married them, drained them, and moved on. Tom wasn't done. She pulled out another document, a background check on Vanessa. Vanessa wasn't just a personal trainer. She had a history of targeting wealthy clients. She'd been fired from 2 previous gyms for inappropriate relationships with married members. There were rumors she'd been involved in a scam where she and a boyfriend would seduce and blackmail affluent victims. Derek and Vanessa hadn't just stumbled into an affair. They were partners. This whole thing had been planned. Tom showed me bank records she'd obtained through less than legal means. She didn't explain how, and I didn't ask. Vanessa had been receiving regular payments from Derek's secret account for almost 2 years, long before they'd supposedly started their affair. They'd been working together all along. The apartment in Brickell wasn't a love nest. It was an investment property they planned to flip once they'd gotten everything they could from me. I felt like I was going to be sick. My entire marriage had been a lie. Derek had never loved me. I'd been a mark, a target, a piggy bank with a wedding ring. Tom reached across the table and put her hand on mine. She told me she was sorry. She said she'd seen cases like this before, and they were always brutal. But she also said I had something most victims didn't have. I'd found out before Derek could finish his plan. She was right. Derek thought I was still playing along. He thought I was going to hand over my retirement accounts. He had no idea I knew what he really was. Tom asked me what I wanted to do with the information. I could take it to Mitchell, build the case, file for divorce, or I could wait, gather more evidence, make absolutely sure Derek couldn't wriggle out of what was coming. I thought about those 2 other women, the ones who'd come before me, the ones Derek had successfully destroyed. I thought about how Derek had looked at me in our bedroom, so smug and confident, how he'd laughed. I told Tom I wanted everything, every record, every proof, every single piece of evidence that would show exactly who Derek was and what he'd done. Tom smiled. She said she was hoping I'd say that. We spent the next hour going through a plan. Tom would continue surveillance on both Derek and Vanessa. She'd track their movements, record their meetings, document everything. Mitchell would prepare the legal documents, but hold off on filing until we had an airtight case. And me? I would continue to be the trusting wife. I would string Derek along about the investment. I would let him think he was winning, because the longer Derek believed he had me fooled, the more evidence he'd create of his own guilt. When I left that coffee shop, something had changed inside. The hurt was still there. God, it still felt like my chest was caving in every time I thought about how thoroughly I'd been deceived. But underneath the pain was something harder. Something cold and sharp and focused. Derek had chosen the wrong woman this time. He'd thought that my success made me vulnerable, that my love made me stupid. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. 2 weeks after my meeting with Tom, Derek was getting impatient. He'd brought up the investment opportunity every single day, his tone shifting from casual to irritated. He kept saying his friend was pressuring him, that we were going to miss out on something huge. I'd been stalling, asking for more paperwork, pretending to consult with financial advisors. Derek's frustration building. He was starting to suspect I wasn't going to cooperate. That's when I made a calculated decision. I told him I'd do it. Derek's face lit up like I just handed him a winning lottery ticket. He grabbed me, hugged me, told me I wouldn't regret this. He said we were going to have the life we'd always dreamed of. I smiled and nodded. Inside, I felt nothing. But I told him I needed 1 week to liquidate the accounts properly without triggering penalties. Derek agreed immediately. He was so relieved that he didn't question why it would take that long. That week, I worked with Mitchell to set the final pieces in place. Tom had been following Derek and Vanessa constantly. She had photos of them meeting at hotels, videos of them looking at beachfront properties in the Keys, recordings of phone calls where they discussed their timeline. Everything was ready, except for one thing. Mitchell told me we needed to freeze Derek's access to our joint accounts before he could drain them completely. But to do that without tipping him off, we needed the bank on our side. And banks didn't usually move that fast unless there was clear evidence of fraud. That's where Rachel came in. My business partner had been checking on me constantly since I'd first called her about Mitchell. I knew something was seriously wrong, but I hadn't told her the details. I'd been too embarrassed, too ashamed that I'd let this happen. But now I needed her help. I met Rachel at the clinic after hours. The place was empty, just the two of us in my office. I told her everything, every detail about Derek, Vanessa, the money, the other wives, the whole sick plan. Rachel didn't interrupt. She just listened, her expression getting darker with every word. When I finished, she stood up and paced to the window. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. Then she turned around and asked me what I needed. I told her about the bank accounts, about how we needed to act fast, but I asked if she knew anyone at the bank we used for the clinic, someone who might be able to help expedite things. Rachel smiled. Not a happy smile, a smile that said she was ready to go to war. She told me her ex-husband was a senior vice president at that exact bank. They'd divorced 3 years ago, but they'd stayed on good terms. She said if anyone could push through an emergency asset freeze, it was him. The next morning, Rachel and I met with her ex-husband, Marcus, at the bank. Mitchell came too, armed with binders of evidence. Marcus listened to everything, reviewed the documents Tom had gathered, and examined the financial records Diana had compiled. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle. He said he'd seen financial abuse cases before, but this was exceptionally calculated. Then he asked me a question that caught me off guard. He asked if I was ready for what was coming. He said once we froze the accounts, Derek would know something was wrong. There'd be no more pretending. The war would be out in the open. I didn't hesitate. I told him I was ready. Marcus made a phone call right there. Within 2 hours, our joint accounts were frozen, pending an investigation into fraudulent transfers. Derek wouldn't be able to withdraw a single dollar without triggering alerts that would go directly to Mitchell. But Marcus did something else too. Something I hadn't expected. He told me the bank's fraud investigation team had been tracking some suspicious activity related to Derek's secret accounts. They'd noticed the pattern of small transfers and had flagged it internally, but hadn't acted because technically the money was coming from a joint account. Now, with our evidence, they could build a case. Marcus said the bank would cooperate fully with any legal action I took. They'd provide records, testimony, whatever. He said Derek had made the mistake of underestimating how seriously banks took fraud, especially fraud this organized. I left that meeting feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Not just hope that I'd survive this, but hope that I'd actually win. That afternoon, Tom called. She said Derek and Vanessa had met at a cafe in Coconut Grove. She'd been recording from a nearby table. According to the conversation, they were planning to close on a property in Key Largo the following month. Derek had told Vanessa the money would be available any day now. He still thought he was going to get my retirement accounts. He had no idea the trap was already closing around him. But Tom had caught something else on the recording, something that made everything click into place. Vanessa had asked Derek what they'd do if I changed my mind about the money. Derek had laughed and said that wouldn't be a problem. He said he had a backup plan. He told Vanessa he'd been slowly building a case that I was mentally unstable, forgetful, irrational. He'd been telling our friends and his family that I'd been acting strange, that he was worried about me. If I refused to give him the money, Derek planned to have me declared mentally incompetent. He'd already consulted with a lawyer about getting financial conservatorship over my assets. Tom said the recording captured all of it. Derek explaining exactly how he'd manipulate the court system, how he'd use my high-stress career as evidence that I was breaking down, how he'd convince a judge that I needed someone to manage my finances for my own protection. And once he had control, he'd drain everything and disappear. I listened to Tom's summary and felt something inside me snap. Not break, snap into focus. This wasn't just about money anymore. Derek had been planning to take away my autonomy, my agency, my entire life. He was going to paint me as crazy and lock me out of everything I'd built. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd said it all out loud, and we had proof. I called Mitchell immediately. I told him I wanted to file for divorce tomorrow. No more waiting, no more gathering evidence. It was time to end this. Mitchell said he'd have the papers ready first thing in the morning. He asked where I wanted Derek served. I thought about it. I could have him served at home, privately, or at the gym, one of his fake business lunches. But that's not what I wanted. I told Mitchell to serve Derek at the restaurant where he'd taken me that night, the place where he'd lied to my face and asked me to fund his escape with another woman. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd make it happen. I hung up and sat in my office at the clinic, looking out at the city. The sun was setting over Miami Beach, in gold and pink. Tomorrow, Derek's world was going to come crashing down. And I was going to be the one holding the sledgehammer. Derek had no idea it was coming. The night before I planned to have him served, he was in a fantastic mood. He'd made reservations at that same restaurant in Wynwood, the one where he'd manipulated me into almost handing over my retirement. He said we should celebrate our fresh start. I agreed to go. One last performance. Mitchell had coordinated everything. The server would arrive at the restaurant during our meal. It would be public enough to make a statement, but contained enough that Derek couldn't cause a scene without looking unhinged. But there was something else I needed to do first. That morning, I'd received a message from Tom. She'd tracked down Derek's first wife, the real estate agent from Atlanta. Her name was Patricia, and she'd agreed to talk to me. We spoke on the phone for almost an hour. Patricia told me her story, and it was like listening to my own life from 5 years in the future. The way Derek had love-bombed her at first, making her feel like the most special woman in the world. How he'd slowly isolated her from friends and family. How he'd convinced her to make investments that never existed. By the time she'd realized what was happening, he'd taken over $200,000 from her. She'd divorced him, but paid him a settlement to make it go away quickly. She said she'd been so exhausted from fighting, so broken down that she just wanted him gone. Then she told me something that changed everything. She said Derek had a tell. When he was lying, really lying, not just small stuff, he'd touch his wedding ring. He'd spin it around his finger like a nervous habit. She said once she'd noticed it, she couldn't unsee every major lie he'd told her. His hand had gone to that ring. I thanked Patricia for talking. Before we hung up, she said something I'll never forget. She told me to make him pay for what he'd done, not just to me, but to her, and to the dentist in Charlotte, and to whoever might come after me if I didn't stop him. She said Derek had gotten away with this too many times. It was time someone fought back hard enough to win. That night at dinner, I watched Derek's hands. We were halfway through our meal when he brought up the investment again. He said his friend was getting anxious, that we needed to move the money by the end of the week. His fingers went to his wedding ring. He spun it twice while he talked. Everything Patricia had told me was true. I was sitting across from a man who'd built his entire life on lies, and I could see the machinery of his deception working in real time. I told Derek I'd made the arrangements. The money would be available in 3 days. He smiled, relieved. He reached across the table and took my hand. He told me I was making the right decision, that this was going to change everything for us. His wedding ring caught the light. The same ring I'd bought him, the same ring he'd worn while sleeping with Vanessa, while planning my financial and psychological destruction, while building a future that didn't include me. I squeezed his hand and smiled back. That's when I saw Mitchell's process server walk into the restaurant. She was a woman in her 50s, professional-looking, carrying a manila envelope. She walked straight to our table. My heart was pounding so hard I thought Derek might hear it. The server stopped beside Derek and said his name. He looked up, confused. She handed him the envelope and said the words I'd been waiting weeks to hear. "You've been served." Derek's face went blank. He stared at the envelope like he couldn't process what it was. Then he looked at me. I didn't say anything. I just watched him. He opened the envelope right there at the table. I saw his eyes scanning the first page of the divorce petition, then the second page where Mitchell had listed the grounds: adultery, fraud, financial abuse, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The color drained from Derek's face. His hand, the one that had been holding mine seconds ago, started shaking. He looked up at me and asked what this was. I took a sip of my wine and told him it was exactly what it looked like. I was divorcing, and I was taking back everything he'd stolen. Derek's shock turned to anger. He started to raise his voice, asking how I could do this, what evidence I thought I had. People at nearby tables were starting to stare. I stayed calm. I told him he should probably read the rest of the documents before making a scene. He flipped through the pages, and I watched his face change as he realized what we had. Bank records, transfer histories, recordings, surveillance photos, testimonies from his previous wives, everything. Derek looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. His voice dropped to a whisper, and he asked how long I'd known. I told him I'd known since the day after I caught him. Every dinner, conversation, every time he'd asked me about the investment, I'd known exactly. He just didn't realize I'd been playing too. Derek's jaw clenched. He told me I was making a huge mistake, that I had no idea what I was doing. I leaned forward and told him I knew exactly what I was doing. I was making sure he never did this to anyone else. Then I stood up, put money on the table for my meal, and walked out. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel Derek's eyes on me, could sense his world collapsing in real time. Outside the restaurant, I got in my car and sat there for a moment. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from relief, from the incredible lightness of finally dropping a mask I'd been wearing for weeks. My phone buzzed. It was Mitchell. He asked how it went. I told him it was perfect. He said good because we had a court date in 2 weeks. He'd filed for an emergency hearing to freeze all of Derek's accounts and assets pending the divorce proceedings. With the evidence we had, the judge would almost certainly grant Derek wouldn't be able to access anything. Not the apartment in Brickell, not his secret accounts, not the properties he and Vanessa had been planning to buy. Everything would be locked down until the court decided who got what. And based on the evidence, Mitchell was confident I'd get back everything Derek had taken, plus damages. I hung up and drove home, to the apartment that wouldn't be my home much longer. I knew Derek might come back angry. I knew this was just the beginning of the battle. But as I pulled into the parking garage, I realized something had shifted. For the first time since I'd walked in on Derek and Vanessa, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like someone who'd taken back her power, someone who'd looked at a man who thought he could destroy her, and said, "Not this time." My phone buzzed. This time it was Tom. She'd been following Vanessa and had just watched her receive a phone call. According to Tom's lip reading, she'd been that close. Vanessa had gone pale and started panicking. Derek must have called her, must have told her everything was falling apart. Tom said Vanessa had gotten in her car and driven straight to the apartment in Brickell, the apartment that was about to be seized as evidence of fraud. I texted back asking Tom to keep watching. I wanted to know every move they made, because this wasn't over yet. The divorce papers were just the opening move. Now came the real fight, the one where I'd have to face Derek in court, expose every lie, prove every theft. But I was ready, more than ready. I'd spent weeks pretending to be weak while building a case strong enough to destroy him. I'd played his game better than he'd ever played mine. And now Derek was going to learn what happened when you underestimated a woman who'd built everything she had from nothing. He thought I needed him. He thought I'd crumble without him. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 8 days after Derek was served. Those 8 days felt like the longest of my life. Derek didn't come home or the next. According to Tom, he'd gone straight to the Brickell apartment where Vanessa was waiting. They'd stayed there for 2 days, and Tom had captured everything. The screaming matches visible through the windows, Vanessa leaving in tears, Derek throwing furniture. Their perfect plan was imploding, and they were turning on each other. On day 3, Derek finally called me. His voice was different, harder, colder. He told me I'd made a serious mistake, that he had lawyers too, that I was going to regret trying to embarrass him publicly. I didn't engage. I just told him to have his attorney contact Mitchell and hung up. But Derek wasn't done. He started calling my friends, my colleagues, even my parents. He told them I'd been acting erratic, that he was worried about my mental health, that I'd become paranoid and delusional. He was doing exactly what Tom had recorded him planning, trying to paint me as unstable. But he'd started too late. The people who knew me didn't believe him, and the ones who might have. Mitchell had already sent them cease and desist letters warning them that Derek was engaging in a defamation campaign. Derek's lawyer was a guy named Ron Whitmore, someone with a reputation for being aggressive but sloppy. Mitchell knew him and wasn't impressed. He told me Whitmore would come in loud, make threats, try to intimidate, but he wouldn't have a real defense because there wasn't one. The morning of the hearing, I put on my most professional outfit, a navy suit I usually wore for medical conferences. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a successful doctor, calm and credible. Derek showed up in an expensive suit I'd never seen before, probably bought it with my money. Vanessa wasn't with him, but I spotted her in the back of the courtroom, trying to look invisible. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Judge Christina Morales. She had a reputation for being no-nonsense and having zero patience for financial manipulation. Mitchell presented our case methodically. He walked Judge Morales through every transfer, every hidden account, every piece of evidence we'd gathered. He played the recording of Derek and Vanessa discussing their plan to take my retirement money. He showed the photos of them looking at properties in the Keys. Then he brought up Derek's past, the 2 previous marriages, the pattern of targeting successful women, the accusations from Patricia, and the restraining order from the dentist in Charlotte. I watched Derek's face as Mitchell laid it all out. He kept trying to look unfazed, but I could see the panic in his eyes. His hand kept going to his wedding ring. That tell Patricia had taught me to recognize. When it was Whitmore's turn, he tried to argue that I was vindictive, that this was a normal divorce being weaponized by a wife who couldn't accept her husband's infidelity. He claimed the money Derek had taken was his right as a spouse, that we'd made those financial decisions together. Mitchell let him finish. Then he stood up and asked the judge for permission to play one more recording. It was the audio I'd captured outside Derek's office, the one where he'd told Vanessa I was easier to manipulate than he'd thought, where he'd discussed his backup plan to have me declared mentally incompetent. The courtroom went silent as Derek's voice filled the space. Every word he'd said, every detail of his scheme, played out for the judge to hear. I watched Judge Morales' expression harden. When the recording ended, she looked directly at Derek. She asked him if he'd like to explain himself. Whitmore tried to object, claiming the recording was illegally obtained. Mitchell calmly pointed out that it had been recorded in my own home, which was completely legal in Florida. Derek just sat there, his face ashen. He had nothing to say, no explanation that could undo what everyone had just heard. Judge Morales took less than 5 minutes to make her decision. She granted an immediate freeze on all of Derek's accounts and assets. She ordered him to vacate our apartment within 48 hours. She issued a restraining order preventing him from contacting me outside of communication through our attorneys. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She referred the case to the state attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. She said the evidence suggested Derek had engaged in a pattern of fraud that went beyond a civil divorce matter. Derek could face criminal charges. I saw him go pale. Whitmore was frantically whispering to him, but Derek wasn't listening. He was staring at me across the courtroom, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw real fear in his eyes. The judge dismissed us, and Mitchell guided me out of the courtroom quickly. Behind us, I could hear Derek arguing with Whitmore, his voice rising. Outside in the hallway, I finally let myself breathe. Mitchell told me that went better than he'd even hoped. The criminal referral meant Derek could end up in jail if the state attorney decided to prosecute. But more importantly, it meant my case was airtight. Derek wouldn't be able to fight the divorce terms. He'd be lucky if he wasn't arrested. Tom was waiting in the lobby. She pulled me aside and showed me her phone. She'd been monitoring Vanessa, who'd left the courtroom the moment things started going badly. Vanessa had just posted the Brickell apartment for sale. She was trying to get out ahead of the sea, trying to liquidate before everything was frozen. Too late. Mitchell had already filed paperwork to prevent any sale of the property pending the divorce settlement. Tom said Vanessa had also emptied her own bank account and bought a one-way ticket to Costa Rica. She was running. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered the way she'd laughed that day and the way she'd participated in Derek's plan to destroy my life. She deserved whatever was coming. Over the next week, everything fell into place. The apartment in Brickell was seized as evidence. Derek's secret accounts were frozen. The state attorney's office opened a formal investigation. And Derek, he moved in with a friend in a one-bedroom in Hialeah, sleeping on a couch. Tom sent me photos, not because I'd asked, but because she thought I deserved to see how far he'd fallen. Vanessa never made it to Costa Rica. She was stopped at the airport when authorities flagged her as a person of interest in an ongoing fraud investigation. Last I heard, she was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was giving them everything on Derek, every detail of their plan, every piece of their scheme. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, but Derek's attorney called Mitchell before we got that far. Whitmore said Derek wanted to settle. He was offering to return every dollar he'd taken, sign away any claim to my business or assets, and accept full responsibility for the debt he'd accumulated. In exchange, he wanted me to ask the state attorney to drop the criminal investigation. Mitchell asked what I wanted to do. He said we could push for the criminal charges, make sure Derek ended up in prison, or we could take the settlement, get my money back, and be done with him. I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted to see Derek behind bars, wanted him to face the full consequences of what he'd done to me and those other women. But another part of me just wanted to be free, wanted to close this chapter and move on with my life. I told Mitchell to take the settlement, but with one condition. Derek had to agree to a confession, a written, signed document admitting to everything he'd done, every lie, every theft, every moment of manipulation. And that confession would be filed with the court as part of the public record. Anyone who searched Derek's name would find it. Any future victim who thought to look would see exactly who he was. Mitchell said he'd make it happen. 3 days later, I sat in Mitchell's office while Derek signed the settlement agreement. He wouldn't look at me, wouldn't speak, just signed his name on every document his lawyer put in front of him. When it was done, Mitchell handed me a copy of Derek's confession, 5 pages detailing everything. His relationship with Vanessa, the hidden accounts, the money he'd stolen, his plan to have me declared incompetent, his previous marriages, and what he'd done to those women. All of it, in his own words, signed and notarized. I folded the document carefully and put it in my bag. Then I stood up to leave. As I reached the door, Derek finally spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. He asked if I was happy now. I stopped, turned around, looked at him one last time. I told him I wasn't happy. Happy wasn't the word for what I felt, but I was never touch me again. Then I walked out and didn't look back. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the lobby of my new clinic in Coral Gables. The space was twice the size of my Miami, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in natural light and a waiting room designed to feel more like a spa than a medical office. Rachel had helped me find the property. Marcus, her ex-husband from the bank, had helped me secure the financing on terms that actually made sense. Tom had even stopped by during construction to make sure the security system was top-notch. She'd become a friend through all of this, someone I knew I could trust. The grand opening was scheduled for next week, but I'd come in early that morning just to walk through the empty space and let it sink in. This was mine, built with my own money, my own vision, my own strength. Not Derek's. Not anyone else's. Mine. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Patricia, Derek's first wife from Atlanta. We'd stayed in touch after that initial phone call. She'd sent me a news article. Derek had been arrested 3 weeks ago. Despite the settlement, the state attorney had found enough evidence from Vanessa's testimony to charge him with wire fraud and identity theft related to his scheme. He'd pled guilty to avoid trial and was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. Patricia's message said simply, "Justice." I stared at the article for a long moment. I'd told Mitchell to take the settlement because I wanted to move on, but knowing Derek was facing real consequences, not just financial, but criminal, did something. It closed a door I didn't even realize was still open. Derek hadn't just lost everything with me. He'd lost his freedom. I replied to Patricia thanking her for letting me know. Then I asked how she was doing. She told me she'd just accepted a promotion at her real estate firm, that she'd started dating someone new, someone kind, that for the first time in years, she felt like herself again. I understood exactly what she meant. The past 6 months hadn't been easy. There were nights I couldn't sleep, days I couldn't stop thinking about how blind I'd been. I'd replayed every moment of my marriage, looking for signs I'd missed, wondering how I could have been so stupid. But my therapist, Dr. Yolanda Martinez, someone Rachel had recommended, had helped me see it differently. She'd explained that people like Derek were professionals at that the reason they succeeded wasn't because their victims were stupid, but because they were skilled at exploiting trust and love. She'd told me something that stayed with me. You didn't fail at seeing who he was. He failed at being a decent human being. Those are not the same thing. I'd started going to therapy twice a week at first, then once a week as I got stronger. Dr. Martinez had helped me process not just the betrayal, but the shame I felt about it. The embarrassment that someone had fooled me so She'd reminded me that I'd also been the one strong enough to fight back, to gather evidence, to take control of my own story. That mattered more than the fact that I'd been deceived in the first place. The clinic door opened and Rachel walked in carrying 2 coffee cups. She handed me one and stood next to me. both of us looking out at the empty space. She asked me if I was nervous about the opening. I told her I was terrified, but the good kind of terrified, the kind that comes with new beginnings. Rachel smiled and said she was proud of me, not just for the new clinic, but for everything. For fighting, for surviving, for not letting Derek break me. I thanked her. I told her I couldn't have done any of this without her help, without Mitchell, without Tom. I'd learned something important through all of this. Asking for help wasn't weakness. Building a support system wasn't dependence. It was survival. It was smart. Rachel had to leave for a consultation, but before she went, she told me something I hadn't known. She said when she'd first introduced me to Mitchell, she'd told him that if he didn't give me the absolute best representation he was capable of, she'd never forgive him. She'd been protecting me from the very beginning, even when I didn't know I needed it. That afternoon, I drove to my old apartment building. Not to go inside, I'd moved out months ago to a smaller but much more peaceful condo in Coconut Grove, but to pick up the last box of my things from the building's storage unit. As I was loading the box, I saw someone I recognized. It was one of Derek's friends, a guy named Marcus who used to come over for poker nights. He saw me and started to walk past without acknowledging, but then he stopped, turned around. He told me he wanted to apologize. He said he'd believed Derek's version of events at first, that I was crazy, that I'd overreacted to a simple mistake, and he'd realized Derek had been lying to all of them for years. He said some of the guys in their friend group had actually loaned Derek money over the years, money Derek claimed he needed for business ventures, money they'd never seen again. They'd all been marks too, just different kinds. I told him I appreciated the apology, and then I said something I'd learned was true. Derek was only successful at his cons because he was willing to lie to everyone. Friends, family, wives. No one was safe from his manipulation. The difference was, some of us fought back. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The box in my back seat contained the last physical remnants of my life with Derek. Photos I'd eventually throw away, some books with his name in them, a few pieces of mail. Once I got rid of this box, there would be nothing left. No reminder, no connection. That night, I had dinner with my parents. They'd flown down from North Carolina when everything had first fallen apart, and my mom had wanted to stay and take care of me. I'd convinced her I was okay, that I needed to handle this myself. But now, sitting across from them at a restaurant in Coconut Grove, I could see the worry in their eyes starting to fade. They could see I really was okay. My dad asked about the new clinic. My mom asked if I was dating anyone. I laughed and told her I was taking a break from men for a while, maybe a long while. My mom said something that surprised me. She told me she was glad I'd left Derek, that she'd never really liked him, never trusted, but hadn't wanted to say anything because I'd seemed happy. I asked why she'd never told me. She said because sometimes people need to figure things out for themselves, that if she'd warned me, I might have defended him, pulled away from her, but by staying quiet and staying close, she'd been there when I finally needed her. It was a kind of love I was only beginning to understand. The kind that trusted me to make my own mistakes and my own recoveries. We finished dinner and I drove them back to their hotel. Before my mom got out of the car, she hugged me tight and whispered that she was proud of the woman I'd be. Not the doctor, not the business, the woman who'd faced the worst betrayal of her life and come out stronger. That night, alone in my condo, I opened my laptop and did something I'd been avoiding. I Googled Derek's name. The first result was his confession, filed as public record. Right there for anyone to see. Below that were news articles about his arrest, about the investigation, about the pattern of fraud. His face stared back at me from a mugshot. He looked older, tired, broken. I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no anger, no sadness, just nothing. I closed the laptop and walked out onto my balcony. The view here wasn't as spectacular as the one from the old apartment, but it was mine, paid for with my own money. Free of any taint from Derek's schemes. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago. The one standing in that bedroom doorway, shaking, used, and heartbroken. The one who'd believed when he said she needed him. I wished I could go back and tell her what I knew, that she was stronger than she thought, that the pain wouldn't last forever, that on the other side of this nightmare was a life better than she could imagine. But I couldn't go back. None of us can. All I could do was move forward, build something new. Become someone. The grand opening of the Coral Gables Clinic was incredible. Over 200 people showed up. Colleagues, patients, friends, even some local press. Rachel gave a speech about partnership and resilience that made me cry. Marcus from the bank sent an enormous flower arrangement with a card that said, "To New Beginnings." Tom showed up with her wife, someone I'd never met before. She told me she normally kept her work and personal life separate, but she'd wanted me to meet the person who'd supported her through all those late nights working my case. It felt like a celebration not just of but of survival, of fighting, refusing to let someone else's cruelty. A week after the opening, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a letter from the dentist in Charlotte, Derek's second wife. She'd heard about the case through Patricia. She wrote to tell me thank you. Thank you for being the one who finally stopped him, for making his crimes public record. Thank you for fighting when she hadn't been able to. She said she'd been came about what Derek had done to her for years. But seeing my case, seeing how I'd fought back, had helped her release some of that. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't Patricia's fault. It was Derek's fault. All of it. And now everyone knew it. I wrote back to her. I told her I understood the shame, the embarrassment, the feeling that you should have known better. But I also told her what Dr. Martinez had taught me, that strength isn't never falling. It's getting back up. We'd all gotten back up, in our own ways, in our own time. That's what mattered. Last week, I got a message through LinkedIn. It was from a woman I didn't know, someone named Jennifer. She said she'd been dating a man for 6 months when she'd decided to Google him. She'd found Derek's confession in the public records. The man she was dating? He'd been using a different name, but the details of his past matched Derek's exactly. Except Derek was in prison. This was someone else, someone running a similar con. Because of what I'd made public, because of the documentation I'd insisted on, Jennifer had recognized the pattern. She'd ended the relationship immediately. She'd reported him to the police. She'd protected herself because I'd told my story. Sat there staring at that I'd fought my battle thinking it was just about me, about getting justice for myself and maybe for Patricia and the dentist. But it was bigger than that. By refusing to stay silent, by insisting the truth be public record, I'd potentially saved other women from going through what we'd endured. That meant something. That mattered. I replied to Jennifer and told her I was proud of her for trusting her instincts, for doing her research, for choosing herself. Then I closed my laptop and looked around my office. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows. I had 3 consultations scheduled for tomorrow, a full staff of people I'd hired myself, a business that was mine and mine alone. Was I happy? Yeah, actually, I was. Not because I'd destroyed Derek, though I won't lie. There was satisfaction in knowing he faced consequences. But because I'd discovered something about myself I didn't know before. I was stronger than I thought, smarter than I thought, more capable than I ever imagined. Derek had tried to convince me I needed him, that without him, I was just a stressed-out doctor who couldn't have fun, couldn't be happy, couldn't succeed. He was wrong about all of it. I never did. And now I was building a life that was entirely my own, a life based on truth instead of lies, on respect on my own strength instead of someone else's. It was the best revenge I could have imagined. Not taking something from him, but building something for myself. Something he could never touch. Something that was mine. And that felt like winning. So that's my story. The whole messy, painful, complicated truth of it. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. Thank you for being here while I told you the hardest thing I've ever been through. I don't know where you're watching from, but I'd love to hear. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're in. Sometimes it helps to know we're not alone, that there are people all over the world listening to each other's stories, supporting each other through the hard stuff. And if my story helped you in any way, if it gave you courage or hope, or just made you feel less alone, please subscribe to this channel. Because I've learned that the most powerful thing we can do is share our truths. And I'm not done telling mine. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, you're stronger than you think.